Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Today, Friday, October 7th, episode 123. Our inimitable controller, Steve, is out this afternoon, so he has left the control of the hardware in my hands. It's not clear that that was a good idea, but we're going to see how we do today. We're going to talk about a number of things. As you know, we're focusing a lot more on the news for any given week, FDA news. So we'll be talking a lot about that. We curate the latest FDA news items from a number of feeds every week now. We review them with our staff. Some of the things we're going to be talking about after we talk about current events. The NIH awarding nearly $300 million to high-risk, high-reward projects from a funding source I know I wasn't even aware of, so hopefully you're interested in that as well. Then we'll talk about updated FDA fees for 2023. I know it can be really confusing, but there are some fees that FDA charges for different filings. We'll be talking about those and letting you know what they are for the 2023 fiscal year. After that, FDA timelines for 2023. To their credit, the agency is trying to make sure they hit some statutory timelines. They don't always. Sometimes they're behind. But we're going to find out what those timelines are for common sorts of submissions. And then this, also updated this week by the agency, is my mobile software regulated? Really, it's a whole bunch of updates to mobile software guidance. You're going to find out what sorts of things are being targeted for enforcement versus what things are being targeted for what they call enforcement discretion, where you can still put it on the market even though it should qualify as a medical device. After that, for those of you who have particular expertise, FDA may be looking for you. There are vacancies on FDA committees that might just be interesting to you, so stay tuned for that near the end. And at the very end, we'll talk about hackable insulin pumps. That's not a feature, that's a bug. We're always going to bring you interesting recalls, and this is a very interesting one by Medtronic. A recall of an insulin pump because you can basically hack into it and take control of it. Not a good place to be, but we'll talk about all that and more in the news. Before that, we're going to run through the upcoming events in the local and national ecosystem. First up, this is a new one this week. This is actually a local company, Functional Fluidics, that is seeking adults who've tested positive for COVID in the last 6 months for a research study. There's a small fee associated with that they pay you. And they're looking for local folks who have had COVID in the last 6 months. Again, a local company. Hard to call them a startup anymore, but they've been around for a little while. And then just recently on October 4th, the Michigan Forum for Digital Health, sponsored by MishBio, put together by MishBio, was held. It was a great event. It was a virtual event with folks from HAP and Health and Human Services, Henry Ford Health System, Trinity Health, Cerner, the EHR folks, and Microsoft Healthcare. So a great event. I'm sure you can get the recording if you go to mishbio.org. And then coming up in just a few days on October 11th, Ann Arbor's own BioSocial is back. And this is being sponsored by Nucleate, Benchling, and My Lead Consulting. It's going to be at Pizza House, October 11th at 5:30 p.m. So don't miss it. Scan the QR code to get the information on how to make it to the BioSocial. And also on October 11th, we told you about this last week. We won't go into so much detail this week, but the Nano Day Symposium, FDA's Nano Day Symposium, is happening also on October 11th. This is all about nanotechnology. If you haven't found out already, if you go to take small nanoparticles to the agency to get them cleared as part of a drug or a device, you're in for a world of hurt. So come hear the latest thinking on nanotechnology directly from the agency themselves. And then just the day after, on October 12th, heading to Ford Field in Detroit, Renaissance Venture Partners Fall 2022 Undemo Day. That'll be happening October 12th. In person. The deadline is long past to present there. But if you'd like to go see a bunch of up-and-coming local startups and a whole bunch of investors. They just sent out the list of who's coming to this, and it's a pretty big list. In person, October 12th, Ford Field. You can go. It's free to attend. So hopefully we'll see you there. And then on October 13th, as a part of this Tech Week and A2 Tech 360, the ever-present and classic Celebrate Invention. That'll be in the afternoon of the 13th at the Michigan Union in Ann Arbor. A bunch of U of M startups presenting there, but little inside hint, this is a place where a lot of folks in the community show up. It's a place where people congregate. So be sure not to miss Celebrate Invention 2022. And then on October 18th, this is a new one that we added this week, the Biotech Forum. This is just down the road in Ohio. BioOhio, this would be the partner organization or the corollary organization in Ohio to our friends over at MishBio. They're presenting a biotech forum October 18th, 9:30 to 3:30, so most of the day down there at Miami University in Ohio, Oxford, Ohio. October 19th and 20th, Device Talks West at the the Santa Clara Convention Center in California, one of those big co-located medical device conferences. So another great place to get connected. And quick on its heels on the other coast, October 24th through 26th, the MedTech Conference powered by AdvaMed. That'll be in Boston on October 24th through 26th. The prior one, Great Medical Device Conference, MedTech Conference, of course, lots of policy folks from the government there. The list is pretty long. October 25th through 27th. This is a new conference series. The first one is the AI Summit. This appears, although we don't know this for sure, this appears to be the reincarnation of the Xavier conferences that Xavier University used to hold, or at least it seems to have a lot of the same players. I could be wrong about that, so that's just an impression at this point. But in Columbus, Ohio, the AI Artificial Intelligence Summit. As you'll see in just a minute, these conferences appear to be doing a good job of bringing FDA folks to the table. You'll see that especially with the Combination Products Summit that's coming up here in a second. But there's the AI Summit on October 27th regarding regenerative medicine. It's better to rebuild things than to replace them. Well, natural history studies to support regenerative medicine. So if you're in regenerative medicine, have a look. This is sponsored by the FDA, but they're bringing a whole bunch of folks together to talk about the best ways to study regenerative medicine. And then on November 1st, I'm proud to say that we're going to be part of the MedHealth Summit happening also at Ford Field in Detroit. MedTech Crossroads is going to be broadcasting, along with other podcasters, live that afternoon from the summit. So come in person. It is free to attend. It's a great place for the ecosystem to get together. But if you're far away or watching from somewhere else in the country and you want to know what's happening, you'll be able to tune in that afternoon, and you'll have a number of hours of live coverage of the MedHealth Summit. So we can't wait to bring that to you, and we hope that you can join us in person. Maybe we'll even interview if you're there in person. November 2nd and 3rd, MD&M Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, great suppliers conference for all the stuff that goes into medical devices. Be sure to go to Minneapolis for the classic MD&M conference. Then November 7th and 8th, it's a joint public workshop, Medical Devices for Opioid Use. This one from FDA promises to be really interesting because they're looking at how do we stop the opioid abuse crisis and what role do medical devices play. Should be a great meeting of the minds there on November 7th and 8th. And then on the 7th through the 9th, another one of these summits in Columbus, this one the Combination Products Summit. Now, if you don't know how valuable what's on that second little part of the slide is, listen closely. Dr. Nguyen and Weinert are both going to be at this summit. And if you are an attendee, you can get 15 minutes of office hours directly with these leaders from the Office of Combination Products at the FDA. This is like pre-COVID stuff. This is like the best of the FDA. In person, you can talk to them, you can talk about things. Now, remember, they're not going to weigh in on your specific application. If there's a specific application underway, they'd want you to talk to the reviewers who are reviewing that. They won't go around their reviewers. But if you have general questions about how this process works and what's important to them and what should be important to you, you can get 15 minutes with these gentlemen. So I hope you, especially if you think you might have a combination product, a combination of a drug and a device, this would be a great place to show up. Then on December 6th, FDA's Broad Agency Announcement Day, they're going to be talking about their interests in extramural research. So if you want to do work for FDA, see what they are asking industry and academia to help with, that would be a good day to have on your calendar. Let's go to the FDA and industry news. This is all fresh for this week, no repeats here. We're going to talk about these that we mentioned at the beginning of the show. An NIH award from a somewhat unexpected source at NIH. Then we'll talk all about FDA's fees for fiscal year 2023, as well as their timelines for this year. What are they trying to hit with their, here's a word you may not have heard, MDUFA timelines? Then after that, is my mobile software regulated? This is a placeholder for 3 or 4 new guidances updated by the agency. Software is ever evolving, and since 2013, the FDA has been scrambling to keep up with their software guidances. Well, they've updated some really important ones that are going to help us understand, is my software a medical device? Is it not a medical device? Or is it a medical device that FDA is just going to ignore for a little while? All of those are good things to know. And at the end, we'll talk about hackable insulin pumps. Turns out Medtronic's having a little problem with an insulin pump that is hackable. Not a good thing to have. We're not going to bring you every single recall out there, but the ones that are interesting, the ones where we could learn something as a community from them, let's talk about those. So let's go right to it. The NIH is awarding about $285 million for up to 5 years worth of projects. Now it looks like a lot of these have been selected. I don't know that these are still accessible. But what it is interesting about this is this comes from the NIH Common Fund through something called the High Risk, High Reward Research Program. And this is worth knowing about because there's a part of NIH that is funding high risk, high reward research projects. There's a term in the industry in the research industry called the color of money. What is the color of your money? And it's a great question to ask government funding sources. And if you need to be late stage translation, that's fine, but you better be ready to get that thing across the finish line. But in this case, this is a much earlier color of money. This is high risk, high reward. They're willing to take some significant risk for ideas that could really move the needle. So this is one to keep an eye on. And to know that about $300 million is going to be flowing into these research projects over the next 5 years. Well, let's talk about user fees. No one likes to talk about money, but the reality is that FDA has to get paid too. And they do it through something called, of all things, MDUFA. It's not the greatest acronym in the world, but we're up to MDUFA V now. MDUFA stands for the Medical Device User Fee Amendments. And this is the 2022 version, but 2022 covers 2023 through 2027. So if that didn't make your head spin, I don't know what will. Before we go into the details, let's talk about some of the terminology here. And if you haven't heard these terms before, or you have but you're not quite sure, here's another refresher. A 510K is a clearance based on substantial equivalence to a predicate device. So if you're going to get your device to market by claiming that you're substantially equivalent to something that's already on the market, a 510K might be for you. Throughout the show, at different times, we've talked about what it takes to get a 510K and how to prepare for it. A PMA, or a pre-market approval, is a Class 3 high-risk device, and the clearance is based on safety and efficacy. These are very large, very hard to clear products. But once they're cleared, they're very, very substantial, very formidable on the market. The de novo pathway allows you to clear a product on the basis of safety and efficacy without any reference to a substantially equivalent predicate, but at a lower burden level. Now, a lot of people get confused because not every device that you take to the market has to be cleared by FDA. There are often Class 1 devices that don't require any clearance at all. You just have to do what's called a registration. And a registration is really nothing more than telling the agency you're there, paying them a yearly fee, and then you're subject to audit. So you better have everything, all your ducks in a row for when they come to audit you. But that's what a registration is. It's not a clearance, but it is required within 30 days of first sale. So if you're wondering, when do I have to register with the agency? It's usually within 30 days of first sale. When do I need my clearance? Well, that'd be before first sale, if you need a clearance. There's also this thing called a 513G that sometimes people mistake for a 510K, and it sounds like I'm about to start saying some kind of a rhyme because all of these numbers sort of blur together in your head. But a 513G is not a clearance. It's an information request to the agency. It's a way to formally get information out of the agency, but there's a fee associated with it. And then the small business. That's actually a designation you can get from FDA. And you'll see in a second why being designated as a small business, it's an important thing if you are a small business, because it all comes down to the dollars. We're going to show you what these dollars are. Apart from any other work that needs to be done by you or your partners, the application fee for a 510K clearance fiscal year 2023 stands at $19,870. That's quite a chunk of change, especially for the smaller startups. But it turns out there's good news. If you're a small business and you get that designation, you can submit for your 510K for just about $5,000. So how do you get that small business designation? Well, among other things, it requires submitting your last year's tax returns, even if they're zero, even if you're a startup, and getting FDA to give you that small business designation. Now, that's something you have to do every year. And here's the trick. FDA's fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th. That means it doesn't do you much good to go in August and do things like registrations or small business designations. In fact, you want to do that as close to that October 1st deadline as you can, so that that registration or that designation is good for the whole next year. With your small business designation in place, the prices for 510Ks, 513Gs, PMAs, and de novos go way down. So 513G is $3,000 instead of $6,000. A PMA is $110,000 instead of $441,000. The cost just to submit a PMA to the agency, if you're a larger company, is already near $500,000. A de novo application to the agency is now $33,000 with a small business designation. But if you don't have that, a de novo is going to set you back $132,000. So some of these fees are becoming non-trivial. And for the smaller startups, the fees without that small business designation can quickly become impactful. Well, let's talk about the registration, because to get your clearance, you're going to want to do the things that we saw on the previous page. But just to register your company with the agency within 30 days of first sale, that's going to set you back $6,493 in fiscal year 2023. And as we were talking about that fiscal year, that's October 1st through September 30th. And like we said, you really want to make sure that you get that small business designation or you do that registration right around that October 1st deadline, not before, especially for the registration. If you register in the middle of September, you've only got 2 weeks for your $6,000. If you register October 1st, you've got the whole year for that registration. It's a little bit strange, but that's the way it works. So for these fees, if you're thinking about what do I need to budget, when do I need to budget it, there's your answer. Go back and re-listen to that section and write those down for your next spreadsheet that you're working on. FDA timelines for 2023. And I think this one's really interesting because as we all know, things always take longer than you expect. There's a lot more to developing a product than just FDA's timelines. But it remains the case that FDA's timelines have been confusing, been hard to understand. And so FDA is trying from their end to clarify some of these, and we're going to do our best to understand them. First of all, the de novo process. The de novo timelines. Let's talk about some terms first. You can get to the guidance document that we're talking about now through that QR code. But let's talk about some FDA terms. First of all, acceptance review. That is whether or not they will accept your package. They haven't read it yet. They haven't evaluated its arguments. This is simply a question of will the agency accept your package? And they give themselves 15 days to do this. So the first 2 weeks of your clock are taken up by the agency deciding whether or not they will accept your package. All bets are off if they say no. If you missed something or missed some element that needed to be there structurally, they're going to send it back to you, back to the drawing board, include it, resubmit it, back to the acceptance review. Then there's the substantive review. This is where FDA is actually substantially reviewing your materials and interacting with you as to whether they think they're good enough. At any point during that, they might ask you for more through an additional information request. And then you have 180 days to respond to that additional information request. We're going to repeat this a couple times as we go through. But when you heard 180 days, guess what? That's often not a lot of time to get your ducks in a row to respond to the FDA, but it sure does eat up a lot of time without the FDA's clock ticking. So as we review these numbers you're about to see, keep in mind that the minute they pull that AI request, their clock is going to stop. And here are their goals. They're looking to make a MDUFA decision. That would either be to grant your de novo request, to decline it, or to withdraw it within 150 FDA days, which are calendar days, from the date that they choose to accept your submission. So after that 2 weeks, they say, yes, we accept your submission. They're shooting for 150 calendar days. Now that doesn't include the time where they go out there and ask you for more. That stops their clock. It looks like they're trying to have 70% of their de novo cases meet this timeline. That's their goal. If they can hit it, then in 2026, they're going to try to make sure that 80% of their de novo cases meet this timeline. If that doesn't seem like a very aggressive timeline, well, keep in mind that this is a novel product, right? This is sort of the low burden replacement for that. We just got a message that we might not have audio. We will correct that shortly. We're hoping we've got audio back, but we're going to find out shortly whether we get that back. So their goal for the performance level is 80% and 90% if the fiscal year 2024 goal is met. Now, that's the Novo. Let's talk for a moment about 510K. For the 510K timelines, you can get to the guidance document there on the QR code that you see on your screen. And some FDA terms you'd like to know. The first is the acceptance review. Did FDA, like the de novo submission, did the FDA accept your submission? The next one, a substantial equivalent or not substantial equivalent decision point. That's the goal. You're looking for them to say that you are substantially equivalent to your predicate device. Because remember, this is based on a predicate device designation. Then there's an additional information request, just like you have when you are doing a de novo. There's also a really amazing response that FDA can make to you, and that is not needed. You don't need a 510K. Well, maybe you should have done more homework, but that's usually a good bit of information to get. You didn't need this submission. So here are the 510K timelines. And we're going to break this down a little more in just a second. The first one is the substantive interaction. This is where FDA is going back and forth with you through additional information requests. Excuse me, they give themselves up to 60 days. Again, these are FDA days or calendar days from the time that they decide to accept your submission. Now, their enthusiasm here is a little bit higher because they think that 95% of their timelines will hit this target. That's a lot more than the 70% we saw for de novo. But it still remains that they have to have accepted your submission before that clock even starts. Then there's the MDUFA decision, substantially equivalent or not substantially equivalent. That's the full 90 days at that point. And they also think that they're going to hit this with 95% confidence. That's really cool. So they're expecting that the average total time to decision, because remember, the clock will pause for additional information requests. They're hoping to be in that 130 to 110 day window overall. But realistically, can we expect that? Here's what it realistically looks like a lot of the time. Let's give you a little bit closer view there. The acceptance review is going to take 15 days anyways. That's going to burn 2 weeks out of your time. Next up comes the substantive interaction with AI requests. Now, that could take 59 out of the 60 days that they have to do this part of the process. When they come back to you with that additional information request, whether it's at day 1 or day 60, you have 180 days to make your response. Now, if your ducks are in a row and you're anticipating what the agency is likely to ask for, you might not need all 180 days. But there are companies that do need all 180 days. So as you start to add this timeline up, even if they only need one more day to finish their substantive interaction at the end, and another 30 days to reach a MDUFA decision, it still remains that this could take up to 285 days. Now, if you look, for example, at IntoBeing's pathsurveyor.com, we didn't bring that up, but if you go to pathsurveyor.com and you look at any 510K that's been issued out there, in fact, any product code, you'll find out that FDA is all over the map for how long it took them to clear 510Ks. Some are short, 90 days, 100 days. Some are long, 300 days, 400 days. So we think that realistically, on average, even though FDA is targeting 120 days or 128 days, we don't expect to see those numbers anytime soon. What's the bottom line for you, for your management, for your company? Don't expect that 90-day number really means anything when it comes to your bottom line. 120 days might be sort of a bottom end for what you could expect. But oftentimes stretching out to 300 days is not that uncommon. So as you think about how long does it take to get a 510K once I've submitted, this range of 120 to 300 days is probably a good one to think about. Now, of course, it wouldn't kick all the way out to 300 unless multiple additional information requests were issued, but that can happen. 285 would be the limit if you only had one and you responded to it. Now, it's also the case that FDA has done the same for PMAs. We're not going to cover that today, but if you want to see that guidance, go ahead and take a look at this link right here. Our next news item that we're lumping together under this question is my mobile software regulated? So what has FDA actually updated here? Well, keep in mind that they've been updating policy since 2013 through quite a few revisions. And there's some categories that they are intent to communicate to us. Each one of these has its own guidance document associated with it. First, software functions that are not medical devices. Secondly, software functions that are medical devices, but for which the FDA intends to exercise enforcement discretion. So the first category, really interesting, because if you're not a medical device and you have software you want to sell but it's not a medical device, you're in a great place. Go out there and do what you're going to do. But what about software functions where FDA intends to exercise enforcement discretion? Turns out that's a really great place to be too, because if FDA says you're a medical device but we're not going to regulate you, wow, that's a great place to be as well. But the one where many folks end up without knowing it are the medical devices that are the focus of FDA oversight. So what's really important about these three categories, if you're a software application, if you're a mobile software application, what's so important is to find out whether you're in or whether you're out. Are you free to do what you want to do? Are you free to do what you want to do under constraints? Or are you really under constraint and you're really a medical device and your team that doesn't know how to clear a medical device is going to have to come up to speed really quickly? We see this all the time in our business where folks misestimate what it is that they're truly up against. So one of our passions is educating on that. And before we get to those three categories, here's something really interesting that FDA said about phones, tablets, and app stores. Because if you're thinking hard about this, you might realize that shouldn't the hardware be considered a medical device? Gene, everything you say on this show, you're always talking about all the scrutiny that things are under. Shouldn't my tablet or a phone then turn into a medical device? What about the app store that delivers the app? Are there any constraints on that? And FDA comes out really clearly and says this: the FDA's mobile medical apps policy does not regulate the sale or general consumer use of smartphones or tablets. It does not consider entities that exclusively distribute mobile apps, such as the owners and operators of mobile application stores, to be medical device manufacturers. Now that may not mean a lot to you, but it's actually huge. Because normally you could think of the hardware and the software distribution folks as being part of what makes a medical device a medical device. But FDA is just summarily saying they are not medical device manufacturers. And the platforms themselves, just because they could be used to run a regulated app, doesn't make them a medical device. This is really great news that they're making this as clear as they have. So let's talk next about this. Software functions that are medical devices and that are the focus of FDA oversight. We're going to bring a web page right up here. We haven't done this in a while, but it's kind of a fun way to look at things together. These are examples of software functions that FDA regulates. We'll go full screen on that. And I did this because there's no reason to regurgitate this on any slides. They give some examples. Really what is happening here is if a software function transforms a mobile platform into a regulated medical device, they're interested. That's where they're going to put their focus. That's where they're going to put their attention. They give some examples. What if we use a sensor or a lead that's connected to a mobile platform to measure and display the electrical signal produced by the heart? We're going to make an ECG. Well, they're very kind to anticipate this, and they even tell you what the product codes potentially are for something like this. What if you did this to project sounds associated with the heart? Have you ever considered an electronic stethoscope? They show you what product code that is likely to fall under. And on and on and on it goes. Quite a few things. So here's step one. If you are considering a mobile medical device running off of a smartphone or a tablet, they might have anticipated the kind of thing that you're doing. They might have already shown you what your product code is. How nice can that be? Then there's software functions that connect to an existing device type for purposes of controlling its operation, function, or energy source, and therefore are the focus of FDA's regulatory oversight. Now, while this isn't a medical device, I get to show you, since I'm holding it, I get to show you some of the cool tech that we use here to run MedTech Crossroads. And before he left for the day, Steve gave me access to the entire control system right here. So on my iPad, we're doing an example here, folks. Here's an app running on here. And with that app, I can switch you between the full screen of that, and I can switch you between this, and I could switch myself to a full camera as well. This is exactly what we're talking about here with the FDA. What if you want to control devices like this studio that I'm in right now using an off-the-shelf piece of hardware like an iPad? Well, that's exactly what they're talking about. And they also give examples of this. What if you wanted to modify the settings of an infusion pump? What if you wanted a wireless remote control for CT scanning because you wanted to step away from the machine? What if you wanted to change things for a cochlear implant or a blood pressure cuff or calibrate your hearing aid? These are medical devices, and they can be controlled from off-the-shelf hardware, and they are medical devices. Next category, active patient monitoring, or to analyze patient-specific medical device data. Again, they have some examples. Physiological signals, bedside cardiac monitors, fetal heart rate data for monitoring of labor progress, process images for diagnostic review. The list goes on. I think the point we're making here on this one, and I'll go back briefly to the to what we have here, and I think we've got the QR code here. I apologize that we don't have that immediately up here. We'll get you that QR code in a second. It's these kind of things where the agency is saying, yep, you're a medical device, but guess what? We're going to make your life easy because we are going to give you some example product codes and tell you what categories you fall into. We think that's pretty cool. Let's talk next about this, and I have summarized this for you. Software functions that are not medical devices. If you're doing something in any of these categories, rejoice, because FDA does not consider these things to be medical devices. And it's a pretty long list. Searchable reference materials. If what your device is doing is making a better and more searchable reference index for commonly accessed medical reference materials, you're in good shape. Educational or training tools for physicians and hospital staff, you're in great shape. This is likely not to be a medical device. Patient education or reference tools. If we're communicating with the patient, we've seen many of these kind of great tools out there. By itself, that functionality is not enough to make it a medical device, even though you're working with the patient. What about running your office and workflow for your office, even if it's healthcare specific? Those are not medical devices according to the FDA. What about generic aids or general purpose products? This one's a little harder to understand, but basically it's places where no specific medical claim is being made, where you happen to have a mapping software that gets you from place to place and you've incorporated it into something that does work with your healthcare providers and your patients. Now, it might be subject to HIPAA, but they're not saying that it's a medical device, even though it's being used in that context. Loggers and trackers for general health and wellness. And it's good that this clarity is there. You might be working with somebody, but you're not making a disease-specific claim. You're just trying to improve their health and wellness. That's great. That's within the category of software, mobile software that's not a medical device. There are some specific carve-outs for electronic health record interfaces. I'd encourage you to look more specifically at that. And then there's patient-specific or reference materials. Now this one is maybe the most interesting of all of these from what I've seen, because this actually gives a little bit of opportunity for innovation in what you might have otherwise thought was a medical device space. Because if you have a diagnosis for a patient, and you want to compare that diagnosis to reference materials, you're allowed not to make the diagnosis through this piece of software, but to present that diagnosis and curated reference materials for that diagnosis. You're allowed to automate that second part of the process. And we think that's pretty cool. It's not something we've heard tons and tons about, but it is a carve-out that has some really cool potential for medical device, well, I shouldn't say medical device, for startups in the healthcare space, in the digital healthcare space. Online health records, communication tools for patients. There are increasing number of ways for patients to manage their own medical records or to send suggestions and ideas to doctors about what they may be going through. While these may be subject to HIPAA, it's still up to the doctor to make a diagnosis. So an app that allows me to aggregate my symptoms and send it to the doctor, who then needs to follow up on those and actually test me for those things, right? They can't use it as a diagnosis. But if it's making my life easier to communicate my problems to the doctor and it's making it easier for them to onboard me, that's something that the FDA is willing to consider not a medical device. And then data processing. There's lots of ways that you can process data that don't rise to the level of diagnosis or treatment that are not medical devices. So again, 3 categories here. The first one we talked about, so sorry, you are a medical device. But wow, FDA did a lot of the pre-processing for you. They thought about product codes, which is really, really cool. Then, software functions that are not medical devices. If you can fit into these, do it and save yourself the headache. Lastly, let's talk about software functions that are medical devices, but for which the FDA intends to exercise enforcement discretion. What does enforcement discretion mean? It means it is a medical device, but we don't want to bother with it. So cool. Let's talk about this for a second. We'll go full screen on this. Again, we probably won't touch every one of these, but if you hear from some of them that we do that a product that you're working with or on might fall something like this, let's get a flavor for what they're willing to exercise enforcement discretion on. First of all, software functions that help patients with diagnosed psychiatric conditions, for example, PTSD, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, by providing a skill of the day, behavioral technique, or audio message that the user can access when experiencing increased anxiety. Well, that's cool, because normally that would be considered treatment of a disease state or condition. And FDA is saying that even though it is, it's low enough risk that we're going to allow you to do that, and even though we should regulate it, we're not going to. Enforcement discretion. Software functions that provide periodic educational information. Or motivational guidance to pregnant people, smokers trying to quit, or people recovering from addiction. It's a similar kind of thing. It is used in treatment, but enforcement discretion. GPS apps for alerting asthmatics for environmental conditions that may cause asthma symptoms, or substance abuse patients when near a pre-identified high-risk location. So sort of doing geofencing to warn people that they're getting close to something that may make their symptoms worse. Again, is that part of treatment? Yeah, it actually is, but FDA is saying it's low risk enough. We're happy for you to do it. Video games to motivate patients to do their physical therapy exercises at home. Software functions that prompt a user to enter which herb or drug they would like to take concurrently and provide information about whether interactions have been seen in the literature. So again, that is helping you to understand what different treatments are going to have as an effect. Risk factors, screening from well-known authorities. The list here goes on. And it's a relatively long one, so we won't go through all of it. But I think what's exciting about this, for me, looking at products and looking at what FDA has done historically, is they're actually making it possible that you can consider to do something that is a treatment, with enforcement discretion, meaning they're going to let you do it without that clearance. Now, again, you're going to need to look very carefully, consult somebody knowledgeable, possibly talk to the FDA for any one of these. What we've said thus far is not carte blanche to go off and do any of these things. But it is an encouragement to see that the FDA is trying to make carve-outs within the software, the mobile software space especially, with clarity enough to find out what you can and can't do. And some of the answers are kind of encouraging because they're letting you do more than you used to be able to do. So we're excited for that. And at any point, if you have a question, you're more than welcome to raise a hand and ask it. We are always happy to take those questions. Looks like we do have a question here from Santa. Let's see, you should be live. Let's see if we can hear you. Looks like you might be muted, and if not, we'll have you type it in. See the hand raised? Looks like you're still muted, but if you want to unmute, or you can type it in. And Santa, I'm so sorry, it might be on our end too that we're not hearing you right now. It could be a hardware thing since Steve's not running the show today. Let me ask if you'd be willing while we're doing our next item to just type in your question or comment, and we will look forward to getting to that. Go right ahead and type that in. And while she's doing that, we're going to talk about what the FDA wants from you. So it turns out that the FDA has advisory committee vacancies. The agency is looking for a few good folks, and we're going to show you what some of those are. We're also going to cut back to this document here. This is medical devices and radiation emitting product committee vacancies. If you have ever fancied yourself an FDA expert, the chance may be here for you to be on one of their panels. The National Mammography Quality Assurance Advisory Committee. The Technical Electronic Product Radiation Standards Advisory Committee. The Anesthesiology and Respiratory Therapy Devices Panel. The Circulatory System Devices Panel. The Clinical and Chemistry and Clinical Toxicology Devices Panel. Dental Products. Ear, nose, and throat devices. Gastroenterology and urology devices, there's one opening there. None for general and plastic surgery, but 2 for general, hospital, and personal use devices. 5 for hematology and pathology. 3 for microbiology devices. 5 for molecular and clinical genetics panels. 2 for neurological devices. 5 for obstetrics and gynecology devices. 1 for the ophthalmic devices panel. 4 for the orthopedic rehabilitation panel. And 2 for the radiological devices panel. Now, if you think they're only looking for clinicians, that's not true. They are looking for all sorts of folks. And many of those are in development. For example, here, biomedical engineers, looking for nurses. They're looking for many clinicians. But for example, dentists, engineers, and scientists who have expertise in the areas of dental implants, dental materials, periodontology, tissue engineering, or dental anatomy. So, something to consider if you are in any of these spaces or any of the things we've mentioned strikes your fancy. Take a look at this page. I think we don't have the QR code, so I apologize. We will post that. We'll post that up later. But if you go to fda.gov/advisory-committees, you will be able to find that, and we're going to try to make that in a way pop up on the screen. At least there it is. So hopefully you can see that, and if not, we'll get it to you separately. So those are FDA advisory committees. And finally, hackable insulin pumps. The Medtronic MiniMed 600 recall. Now, we don't like to focus on recalls, but here's the reality. They happen from time to time, and when those examples are interesting enough, we're going to bring them to you. This one, the MiniMed 600, is linked up with the insulin pump, the Link 3 transmitter, the blood glucose meter, and this CareLink USB device. And it turns out that what Medtronic has found is an issue through internal testing, whereby the communication between the components of the pump system could be compromised through unauthorized access. Now, for that to happen, you'd have to have hands on to the pump. It's not an internet problem. You can't do this through the internet. But the lesson is really this. This is why we focus on it. There are additional modes that can make a device hard to protect. Engineering modes are very common. So if you're dealing with an embedded system, medical device, you'll often hear your software folks saying, oh, we'll just put an engineering mode on it. Or we'll just do this, or we'll just do that. Here's a real-world example with no one other than Medtronic, where they find themselves having to make a recall because a mode was too porous. And it's not even a mode that I think is that critical to the normal function of the device. It's an extra bolus mode. It's one that releases an extra bolus of insulin to the patient. But of course, that can result in overdose, and that is a problem. Finally today, and I apologize because it sounds like we were having some audio problems. If there were indeed audio problems, this recording will be posted later on. Hopefully it'll have all that fixed on YouTube and you'll be able to watch it, but I do apologize for the issues today for those of you who were having them. MedTech Crossroads indexing. We are busy going back and indexing past episodes of MedTech Crossroads so that each of these segments that you have seen are available, and they're going to be available transcribed. So if you want to read what was said, there's an example from our friends over at My Lead Consulting when they were on the show a number of months ago with the text of our discussions right there. And so just a great way to be able to reference things back. Look for that in coming weeks. We hope you enjoy that feature. Well, we are appreciative of everyone who's here today. We apologize for the audio problems that had happened, but we do appreciate you being here today. We'll get those fixed up, and we'll be back with you next week here on MedTech Crossroads. Thanks again. Bye-bye.